Welcome to the Choir Conductor Podcast. Each episode features a conversation with people in the choir or music education profession. I am your host, Zach Thompson. Let's start the show. My guest today is David Hayes. David is a conductor with an unusually broad range of repertory, spanning the symphonic, choral, and operatic genres. His role as the music director of New York Choral Society complements his other roles as music director of the Mannes Orchestra and staff conductor of the Curtis Symphony Orchestra. You can find out more information about David and the NY Chorale at nychoral.org. That's nychoral.org. So, David, when did you first become the music director of the New York Choral Society?
In the summer of 2012.
Okay, and so, that's 6 years ago now?
Yeah, so this is the beginning of my 7th season, yeah.
Okay, and can you tell us a little bit about how you came about to be the conductor of the New York Choral Society, and then really how you became a conductor in general?
Well, I'll do the Choral Society first. I had been for 20 plus years. I'd been director of a professional chorus in Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Singers, and I became music director of that ensemble in 1992. And then around 99 or so, I also became music director of the Mannes Orchestra in New York. So for about, well over a decade, I had been commuting regularly up back and forth to New York. And I got towards the, it was 2011, 2012 and everything, and I was coming up on over 20 years as music director of the Philadelphia Singers. And so I was starting to think that it was probably time to move on from that music directorship. It wasn't any dissatisfaction in the sense of it, just that, I sort of thought that, a music directorship that's 20 years long, that's an awfully long music directorship. And I was not the founding director. I was the second director. And I thought that it was probably time for me to do something else creatively and for them to have different creative influence and stuff. So I decided that I was going to expand my activities in New York, and mostly I had envisioned just expanding my activities with the Mannes Orchestra in New York. And then I got a call from New York Choral Society I think it was in 2011. They were looking for a new music director and wanted to know if I was interested. And I sort of thought, that would be interesting. I had a professional chorus. We had as part of that, there was a 32-voice professional chorus. And as part of that ensemble, we had a symphonic chorus that was 50% professional and 50% volunteer. But I had never actually directed a fully volunteer chorus, so I thought, well, this would be an interesting new challenge. So I applied for the position and ultimately was chosen as the music director in 2012. And that began my association with the New York Choral Society. As far as becoming a conductor in general, my early musical training was as an instrumentalist. I was a violinist and then studied all the way through, middle school and high school, and then was very interested in becoming a conductor because strangely enough, and this is where sort of the whole thing sort of falls together. My grandmother was a singer with the Tanglewood Festival Chorus, which is the Boston Symphony's chorus, and so I had sort of spent most of my teenage years kind of just going to chorus rehearsals and chorus and orchestra rehearsals, and so I had envisioned becoming actually an orchestral conductor. And through my studies on violin and then subsequently viola in college, I started studying conducting. ended up at the Curtis Institute in Philadelphia in the mid-'80s. Studied there with Otto Werner Mueller for 3 years. I had previously studied with Charles Brook at the Monteau School up in Maine. And my idea had been that I was going to pursue an orchestral career, even though I'd had this sort of like choral background. And lo and behold, when I graduated from Curtis, one of the positions that opened up was a local one in Philadelphia, which was assistant conductor of both the Philadelphia Singers and the Opera Company of Philadelphia. It was a dual position. And I auditioned for that, got that job, and I was the assistant conductor for both for 2 years. And then my predecessor at Philadelphia Singers, who was also the chorus master at Opera Company of Philadelphia, which is now Opera Philadelphia, he passed away, and I was interim director of the Philadelphia Singers for a year, and then subsequently, after a big, long search, ended up being chosen as music director. And at the same time, I went on faculty, back on faculty at Curtis as staff conductor of the orchestra there. So I was doing a lot of work with the Curtis Orchestra. I was doing a lot of work with the Philadelphia Singers. We were the resident chorus of the Philadelphia Orchestra starting in 2000, but right from when I started in 1992, I was preparing choruses for the Philadelphia Orchestra, and that continued all the way until I left in 2015. But it was this, I have this very unusual career in that I have had my feet sort of solidly in both worlds, both the choral world and the orchestral world, which is somewhat unusual for, most people specialize in or focus on one or the other, but I've sort of uniquely been living in both worlds for all of my professional career, which has actually been really, I love the challenge of both. And people have always asked me if I wanted to, prefer one over the other, and I actually don't prefer one over the other. I think if I had to do one or the other exclusively, I wouldn't be as happy. But I'm now like I said, in 2015, I left the Philadelphia Singers, and I still do work at Curtis, still do some work at Temple University with the orchestra there, but mainly with New York Choral Society and with Manus here in New York. So that's, in a nutshell, that's kind of where I've been.
Yeah, and it's definitely, I guess, rare or not the normal path for most conductors. They are either I am a band guy, or I am a choral person, or I only do orchestra. Right. And that's great that you're able to do both and at such a high level at so many places at the same time.
Yeah, I've been very, very fortunate. I really am. Not only is it an unusual career path, it's the chance to work, on the levels that I've been working at, and with the ensembles of the quality that I've been working at for all of this time has just been, I've been really fortunate. But I just love doing. The fact living in both worlds, I really do love living in both worlds, but it is definitely unusual. I don't know that many people that sort of inhabit the two worlds quite the way that I do.
Right. And so whenever you go to either an orchestra rehearsal or a chorus rehearsal, or sometimes when they're both combined, do you have to make a flip in your brain, or can you communicate kind of the same way to either ensemble?
I honestly, for many, many years, for my own conducting students, and just even for myself, I've long held this idea that I'm not a fan of the idea of this kind of, sort of false wall that's between choral world and the orchestral world. And I've long sort of held this idea that there's no such thing as choral conducting or orchestral conducting. It's really kind of either good conducting or bad conducting. And each ensemble itself has a kind of a unique characteristic, and there are certain things you have to know about each ensemble. You certainly have to know about the voice, and you have to understand the issues of the voice. You have to know about the orchestral side of things and the issues of the orchestra. But the basic technique of conducting, the gestural language, all of these ways of communicating musical ideas, are more or less the same. I don't really change what I do when I'm in front of the chorus or in front of the orchestra. I mean, I'm sure there are subtle ways that it's a little bit different just because I'm dealing with the slightly different idioms. But basically, in my mind, I'm running a rehearsal, and I'm not thinking, I have to conduct I'm with a chorus, so I have to conduct in a different way, or I'm with the orchestra and I have to conduct in a different way. It's just something that doesn't enter into my thought process. The gestures and the working language for the two ensembles, I slip back and forth between whatever is necessary, but the basic commonality of approach in terms of gesture and rehearsal process and all of that kind of stuff, for me is pretty much the same.
Yeah, that's refreshing to hear, and it must be a great example, especially for your students, that even though you might think that you are going on this one path, there's all these other areas open, and that you, in this modern world, need to be able to do more than one thing if you want to be successful.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I tell my students that all the time, that they should never, at the stage of their careers that they're at, they should never feel like, oh, I'm only going to do one thing. You have no idea where your path is going to take you, and if they need experience vocally, they need experience chorally, they need experience orchestrally. All these different kinds of the more round they are as a conductor in terms of their experience and their ability to navigate between the various different kinds of ensembles and musical idioms and such, that is really going to serve them well in their conducting lives. And the idea that they wouldn't consider to, if a professional chorus came to them and offered them a music directorship, my God, why wouldn't you take it? And I think that's a really important thing for young conductors, is to stay as open as possible to the possibilities, because I certainly did not imagine, even though I had a kind of a choral background in growing up, I had not planned on this particular path. It was really in my head I was going to be, go down an orchestral path, a more, very traditional orchestral path, and circumstances put opportunities in my way that allowed me to grow and experience all kinds of different worlds that I never had imagined that I would be doing. And so I think it's really, really important to be open to a whole variety of career possibilities, not just, I'm training to do X, and if Y comes along, I wouldn't consider it,
Yes, that's definitely important. And speaking of conducting both choir and orchestra, could you talk about your upcoming season for New York Choral Society?
Sure. We have in addition to some contracted services that we have with the Richard Tucker Gala and to be the chorus for Andrea Bocelli, and some other contracted services and things that we do in addition to our own subscription work. We basically have 4 concerts this year. The first one is coming up in November, and that was a concert that I had really wanted to do as a 100th anniversary of the armistice for 1918. And originally I had sort of the idea of maybe doing the War Requiem, but it for a variety of reasons, that plan fell through. And when it sort of fell through, I ended up wanting to still mark the anniversary of the armistice in some way. But then I also sort of got kind of down a rabbit hole of research, and I realized that 1918, if you go ahead 20 years to 1938, then particularly in November of 1938, that is when Kristallnacht occurred. And you start to realize that the unresolved problems of the First World War in 1918, 20 years later, essentially exploded into the Second World War. I mean, that's a fairly well-known, that the Second World War is basically a continuation of the First World War. And suddenly it struck me that we could do Michael Tippett's A Child of Our Time which grew out of Tippett's reaction to the horrors of the pogroms of Kristallnacht in November 1938. And what struck me about the program itself was that it was not only a way of marking the armistice in 1918 and Kristallnacht in 1938, so it would be the 80th anniversary of that, but the idea that A Child of Our Time is a work that really transcends the historical specificity of the story. I mean, the basic outline of the story of what happened during Kristallnacht is there, but he really universalizes it so that it becomes a piece about what happens, sort of, man's inhumanity to man, and what happens when you scapegoat and you demonize, quote unquote, the other in society. And it seemed to me that was a powerful statement that needed to be repeated in this day and age. And it sort of began to coalesce in my mind that, well, here we have the armistice on November 11th, 1918. In November 8, 9 of 1938, we have Kristallnacht. So if I use a work that would commemorate the armistice, and I settled on Gerald Finzi's Requiem to Camera, which is a very early, very unknown work of Finzi's to most people, short 23-minute work on some war poetry from the First World War, which he wrote in honor of his composition teacher who died in the last weeks of the war. And put these two works together, that they could create a kind of a very powerful overall statement about the time period then and the time period we're living in now. And I ended up filling out the program because I thought I just needed a tiny, tiny bit more to fill out the program. And originally I was going to do I struck on the idea of doing the Barber Adagio for strings, which in a little since we have the orchestra there, and with a little bit of research, I suddenly discovered that the world premiere of the Adagio for strings took place on November 5th of 1938, so just before Kristallnacht actually occurred, and that Toscanini premiered it with the NBC Symphony here in New York in November of 1938, and it was broadcast nationwide. And it was a particularly powerful statement at that time, because Toscanini was a virulent anti-fascist and very much against Mussolini, and had in fact left Italy and was not allowed back. So there were all of these kind of influences wrapped up together in this program that I thought, well, if I did those three things together, that would make a really kind of cohesive and very powerful statement. And then I struck upon the idea, since Barber made the transcription for the chorus of the Adagio for strings in 1968, 67, which became the Agnus Dei, and I thought about this idea of, and I'm not the first one to do it, other people have done it, but it's not very often done this way. I thought about, what if I just combined the two versions and had the strings doubling the chorus, and they sing the Agnus Dei and the strings play the Adagio for strings, and then suddenly we have this incredibly powerful hybrid work that would I think really round the program out. So that's the sort of the November program that we're doing, which I'm really actually very proud of from a programmatic standpoint. We have a Christmas program that's going to focus on Britain's Ceremony of Carols. Then we're going to be doing in February, we're going to be doing a performance of the Onager King David with a contemporary performance artist and actors doing the narrator and the Witch of Endor. And so there'll be dancers and narration. I'm trying to sort of put it a little bit more towards its early roots when Onager first wrote the work as a kind of a multimedia work or multi-genre work. It wasn't just a concert work. So we're going to be doing that in February, and then we're going to conclude the season in May with the East Coast premiere of Randal Thompson's Requiem in its version for double string orchestra accompaniment. So in a way, the barber with the strings doubling the vocal work is a kind of a precursor or a preview, if you will, of the setting that Thompson created of his own Requiem, which uses doubling strings. And it's a work that I'm very much associated with because at the Philadelphia Singers, we gave the first performances of a professional chorus ever of the work in 2012. And it was the first performances of the work in its almost 50-year history. There had only been 6 complete recorded performances there, and we know this because the publisher kept track of how many performances there were. Which is pretty astonishing. It's a major work of Thompson, one work that he considered, his essentially, I think, his masterpiece. And was a work that he felt very, very proud of. But it was difficult for double chorus a cappella. It's about 50 minutes long. It's not a liturgical requiem. It's text taken from all over the Bible to create what he called a narrative dialogue between 2 choruses. One representing the choruses of the departed spirits, and one representing the people who have been left behind. And the dialogue that takes place between these 2 choruses over the course of this 5-part, 50, almost 60-minute work is essentially a discussion about the nature of grieving and life, death, and how one, out of the grieving of death, there comes life and a great sense of hope for moving on. And I thought that this would be a really good piece to end this kind of season, which the whole piece, the Thompson moves from darkness to light. The tippet, in a way, moves from darkness to light. So we kind of crafted this season that's about going from darkness to light. And as I said, the Thompson itself is a work that I'm very, 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 very associated with. Because at the Philadelphia Singers, in addition to giving those performances in 2012, we gave another set of performances in 2014 and then recorded the work. And it's the only recording, world premiere recording it's on Naxos, that exists of the work. And we went about it hoping that we could help spark the return to the repertory of this piece, because certainly 50 plus years later, a lot more choruses can and should be doing this piece. But most choral directors don't even know that the piece exists. So we created this recording to try and bring the piece out to the general public so people could hear it. So I'm very attached to the work. And it's interesting to revisit it in its other guise, which is the version that Thompson created after the original version for double string orchestra, along with the double chorus. So that's the scope of the season.
Yeah, that's amazing. And so in preparation for this interview, I went ahead and listened to your recording of the Requiem by Randal Thompson. I mean, it's fabulous. It's extremely difficult.
Yep, it's a very difficult work, but it's so incredibly rewarding, and
yes.
It's a work that I really feel very strongly about, that deserves to be performed. And like I said, our hope in creating that recording was to try and give a little bit of possible life to the piece, so that people would be able to hear it and and think about doing it on their own programs. And if you don't do it in the original version for double chorus a cappella, which is tough, it's not, having done it, I can tell you, it's not easy. But the string orchestra accompaniment that he created for it had its world premiere in Minnesota last year. I think it was last year, had its world premiere in Minnesota. But he created the string orchestra version within 2 or 3 years of the original version, and it just laid there. I mean, nobody knew about the original version. Nobody knew there was this double string orchestra version of it. So, I'm hoping that both versions will start to gain currency and that people will perform it in both versions. I'm revisiting it myself now in the other version, which is going to be an interesting, turning to go back to the work and work on it in a very different guise with the string orchestra doubling is going to be really fascinating. So for me, it's something very, very exciting to go back to the work, but in a slightly different version.
Yes, and I love Randal Thompson's music, and not just because he has my last name. But yeah, most choir conductors know him for his Frostiana and other things like that, and he's kind of known for accessible yet beautiful music, and this is kind of the opposite end of the spectrum for him. And like you said, it is lesser known. I'm glad that you were able to do that, and you are programming works of such high caliber.
Yeah, I feel very strongly about the piece, and it's so gorgeous in its own way, but it is, from the standpoint of the demands that he makes on the chorus, it is kind of extravagant, the demands that he makes on the chorus. And I think the reason why it didn't sort of gain currency immediately was partially that, and it sort of was a piece that at the time in 1958, I think much less so these days, but in 1958, his his target audience, if you will, for his pieces were collegiate and volunteer choruses. Those were the sort of the bread and butter of people that did the Alleluia and the Frostiana and Americana and all the other pieces. And I think this piece's extravagances kind of went beyond where those types of ensembles were in 1958. And as a result, it just kind of fell off the map, and it never recovered. I mean, it just literally just fell off the map. So hopefully more people will become aware of it, become aware of how beautiful it is, how amazing and dramatic it is, what a great piece it really can be, and give it a shot, because I like I said, I really think it deserves to be part of the American choral canon.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Circling back, your upcoming concert is at Carnegie Hall.
Yes.
On November 12th.
Right.
And people can find out more information at nychorale.org, and I'm going to put that in the show notes. Congratulations to have that event at such a prestigious concert hall and venue.
Yeah.
That would be fantastic.
Yeah, we do. We generally, one of our regular venues is Carnegie, so it's not an unusual venue for us, but it's, I'm trying to be more conscious of, putting the right piece in the right venue. I mean, this concert clearly should be at Carnegie, but the Onagar we're going to do at Central Synagogue, which is a really kind of a nice way of going about the sort of the story, and it's a great venue, a beautiful synagogue here in New York, and so that concert will be there, and we do the Tucker Gala, which is also at Carnegie Hall, and usually 1 or 2 concerts a year at Carnegie on a regular basis.
That's great. And so, can you talk about what your thoughts are on the future for the repertoire for the NY Chorale?
Yeah, I'm really focused on trying to find a blend for the chorus that includes not only the canonical masterpieces. As a performing institution, I think we have a duty to keep the great masterpieces alive. It's sometimes astonishing to me that you used to be able to count on the fact that even in school choruses, people got little bits and pieces of Elijah and the Mozart Requiem and some of the other great masterpieces of the canon. And nowadays it's sometimes amazing how little of these works are being performed. And certainly, look, they've been recorded dozens and dozens and dozens of times, but it's not the same as people coming together and performing them live, and people experiencing them live. So I always want to make sure that part of our programming includes the great canonical masterpieces. I'm also very interested in doing works of well-known composers and not so well-known composers, but works that are lesser-known works. I think sometimes we lose sight of the fact that, for a variety of reasons, very worthy works just kind of don't make it to the forefront of the concert public all the time. And that is people that are famous composers. I mean, a couple of years ago I did the Von Williams C Symphony, and in front of it I put the Beethoven Calm Sea and Prosperous Voyage, which is a small work for chorus and orchestra. But the opportunity to hear the Beethoven live is highly, highly unusual. So I'm always looking for lesser-known works of famous composers, but also lesser-known works of composers that are themselves lesser-known but really worthy of being performed. So that's another prong of the programming priorities. And then the final prong is works that are being written certainly within the last 30 to 40 years, but up until today. I'm very interested in making sure that that we're doing works of our time, that we are seeking relationships with composers, that in time I'm hoping that we get enough of a funding background to be able to do some commissioning work of our own. But in the meantime, there's a lot of pieces that have received world premieres, but they are desperately seeking second and third performances. And I think that that's also a role that we can play. It's always hot to give the premiere, because that's where you get sort of you get the great glory of the premiere. But the problem usually happens, and most composers that I know are there. The premieres are great, but then the problem is, oh my God, how do I get a second performance? How do I get a third performance? So I think I'm always on the lookout for works that are works of our time, but maybe have sat for a while and not received a second or third performance. For instance, we did last year, we gave the East Coast premiere of Frank Ticheli's Third Symphony, which is a choral symphony subtitled The Shore, which had been premiered 5 years ago in Orange County with Pacific Chorale and Pacific Symphony. And my good colleague and friend John Alexander, who was the music director, said to me, you should look at this piece, you should take a look at it. And I did, and fell in love with it, and brought it to one of our performances last year in Carnegie, and it was a huge success. People absolutely loved it. But people kept saying, it was like, oh my God, why did it take 5 years for this work to get a second performance? It's a good work, and I think there are a lot of pieces like that. So I think it's important for us to not only be seeking out the world premieres, but to be looking for works that are great works, but just are desperately seeking a second or a third performance. So those are kind of some of my programming priorities. I'm also very interested in mixing media with the chorus, in the sense of adding maybe adding a dance element, not the chorus dancing, mind you, but adding a dance element, adding another visual element to it, adding, perhaps, the chorus performing with film, doing something of that nature. There's so many ways that we can engage our other senses in the concert hall with, when it makes sense, and not that, and not in a way that takes away from the music itself, but actually makes the music enhanced, or in some cases just illuminates it in a different way. So I'm also seeking opportunities to do that with the chorus, and finding the right venues for those performances. Maybe Carnegie Hall for a piece that involves dance or something. Maybe that's not the right venue. for it. So I have no problem, seeking out really interesting venues to match with the music and the genres that we're kind of trying to combine. So those are some of my programming sort of priorities.
That's great that you're trying to strike a balance between new and old, and constantly performed in some other hidden gems that are lesser known. That's fantastic. And also that you are consciously pushing ahead and trying to be on the forefront of things in a time that so often the classical or the arts groups get a bad rap for just standing and singing or sitting and playing without adding other elements that a lot of the other arts are starting to do. And that's refreshing to hear that you are also starting to implement those with your choir and orchestra.
Yeah, I do think that we have, certainly other art forms are beginning to push in this direction. I think we have to face the fact that, we live in a very visually oriented society. And the sort of typical choral concert where it's, you're looking at a bunch of people standing up there static, as dramatic as the music can be, in some cases, maybe combining with some other kind of art form enhances it. I'm certainly not advocating doing things that are gimmicky or turning, making the music second to some other kind of flashy visual element or something just for the sake of having some kind of flashy visual element. But I do think that there are a lot of works that we can think about that maybe would be enhanced by dance or would be enhanced by some kind of visual artist. And the more that we're open to that kind of thing, and also unusual performance venues. I mean, I keep joking to people that, we have this very famous thing here in New York called the High Line, which is an old railroad track that got turned into an urban park, basically, that runs down the west side, and it's hugely successful. But there's another project that's sort of still in its nascent stages that's called the Low Line, which is actually an underground on the Lower East Side. It's an underground trolley sort of hub where they would turn the cars around and things like that. So it's this huge underground space. And there's a group of people trying to figure out ways to, using creative glass and mirrors and things like that, bring sunlight underground to create an underground park, basically. And I keep joking to the chorus. I said, if we find the right piece and this thing gets off the ground, I would love to just go do a concert there. I mean, there's another concert series that's just begun in Greenwood Cemetery in one of the crypts in the Greenwood Cemetery, where they have a whiskey tasting outside at sundown, and then you go into the crypts and listen to these performances. And they're fabulous the way that they've been doing this. But these are interesting ways of taking people to unusual places, and it doesn't take away from the music, but you get these added extra elements that people I think really enjoy, rather than sort of just going to a standard concert hall and sitting there. It adds other elements to the experience, and I think that's the bottom line, is that from a standpoint of concert experience, we have to be thinking, particularly as choruses, but as all classical arts. I mean, we have to be thinking about the concert experience and what does that mean for our audience, and how do we make it the best possible experience. And sometimes that's going to mean being in Carnegie Hall, and sometimes that might mean being in a crypt in Greenwood Cemetery.
That's amazing. Speaking of musical experiences, do you have a favorite performance, either as an audience member or conductor or musician?
Gosh.
I know it's hard to choose one.
I'll tell you one that I think for me is sort of an experience that, out of dozens of wonderful, great experiences, is the one that I think, I can still almost viscerally feel in my body. The very first time I heard Mahler 8 was in Boston, in Symphony Hall in Boston. Seiji Ozawa was conducting, and my grandmother was singing in the chorus. And I remember sort of sitting in the middle of the hall, and Symphony Hall in Boston, I don't know if you know it, is a kind of a rectangular concert hall, built along the lines of the Musikverein in Vienna. Wonderful hall, great acoustics and everything. But, the chorus was so large that they had spilled out a little bit into the balconies along the side. So they had sort of auxiliary chorus 1 and 2 sitting on the side balconies closest to the proscenium arch, and then the full chorus and orchestra and the 8 soloists and everything on stage. And at the end of the first part, I remember this as the, those big rolling scales, those upward scales at the end of the first part. All of a sudden, I saw, and just being thrilled by having like sonic 3 sides around me, having this sonic experience and thinking, oh my God, this can't get any better. And then very much towards the very end, Ozawa turned around and fired a cue to the back of the second balcony, and the additional brass band that was in the back of the second balcony let loose a wave of sound from the back. And so suddenly we were swimming in this 360 degrees of sound. And I will never forget the feeling of it literally was like just waves of sort of like, hair on end, through the end of that first part there. And it was just one of those pieces where I just sat there and I thought like, well, if you're going to have to go, you should probably have to go in the middle of that piece because, or that experience. But it is certainly something that has stuck with me. And I think when I heard it, I was 16 maybe, and I still haven't forgotten how that felt and what it was, that awesome cue to the brass in the back of the second balcony.
Yeah, Mahler 8, the ending is pure heaven.
Yeah.
It's fantastic. I performed it with Nashville Symphony Chorus, and we combined with Cincinnati Chorus in their orchestra. And, it's a massive work, but
yep.
the ending is unbelievable.
Yeah, it's pretty unbelievable.
Yeah. What advice would you give your younger self?
I suppose if I was going to give my younger self advice, it would be to everything that I did do, to just do more.
Yeah.
That sounds crazy. It's sort of like, I sometimes feel like it's sort of like, wow, I did a lot and I've done a lot, but I always feel like I could do more. And I would just, times when I felt like I was goofing off and I could have done something else. But I suppose just to experience more, to do more, to read more, to think more. One of the things that I always try and remind myself to do, and I'm never very successful at, is to actually carve out time in my schedule to just think. It's because I'm so involved all the time, just doing, whether it's a rehearsal or performance or running to this meeting and, running to that rehearsal. And it's just this never ending cycle. And the idea of actually just sort of having time to sit and think is something that I wish I had a lot more of. And I also wish that I had done a lot more of along the way.
Yeah, and especially in our modern era with cell phones and notifications and email, and just being able to sit there and not do anything else but think is rare and rare.
It's rare. It's getting harder and harder and harder. But if there was one thing I wished I had done more of and still wish I was doing more of, it's just being quiet and thinking.
Yes. And you mentioned having the time to read. Do you have a favorite book? Or series?
I have lots of, I tend to read a lot these days. I tend not to read a lot of fiction. When I was younger, I used to read a lot of fiction. But I tend to read a lot more history and nonfiction these days. And I don't know why that is, but there's something. I'm a big history buff, and I love I love reading. I've been in the last 5 years, I've been devouring World War I nonfiction, just the history of it, because I wanted to learn more about it, and I didn't. I felt like I knew the broad strokes of it, but I didn't really realize the details and why things happened and how what happened in the 14 to 18 war. We're still living with the ramifications of that in a way that I think most people don't understand. The whole carving up of the Middle East took place out of that war, and the problems of what happened when they tried to carve up the Middle East in a sort of not so, shall we say, wise way. Created the problems that we're still trying to work through now. So it's a really fertile period, this whole, and I also find that it goes with my sort of real music. I have a huge musical interest in the whole period from about 1890 to 1920. That period in musical history is one that I'm extremely interested in and fascinated by. It's just something that I spend a lot of time reading about and thinking about from all sorts of angles, from just general political history, military history, artistic history. It's an incredible period that we're still trying to sort out from that. So I tend to read a lot about that particular era.
Your passion for history definitely is evident in your programming choices for your repertoire, and that's I'm glad to hear that. Other than music, do you have any hobbies, or do you have time for hobbies?
I don't have a lot of. I don't have what I would consider necessarily hobbies. I have lots of guilty pleasures in terms of things that I love to watch. I'm a huge Star Trek fan from original series on. Nice. So I love all things Star Trek. So that's one thing. But I'm also into British comedies. And I could probably quote most everything out of Are You Being Served? And Little Britain and Blackadder. I love those. I absolutely love old time radio. I love listening to old time radio, like basically stuff from the 30s, 40s. I used to subscribe to this website that had all kinds of old radio shows that when you subscribe to it you could download. So I've got a hard drive full of old radio shows, complete with the ads, which are really cool. The old ads are amazing. So sometimes I get down that rabbit hole of sort of old radio shows, and those are. When I have time, I try and sort of turn my brain off, if you will, by if I'm not reading, then I'm watching one of those kinds of shows or listening to one of those shows.
Yeah, that's definitely interesting. Well, David, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. Again, if people are interested in learning more about the New York Choral Society, they can go to nychorale.org. David, thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for chatting with me.
Thank you for listening to the Choir Conductor Podcast. Please subscribe to our podcast on iTunes and leave a review. Go to zackthompsonmusic.weebly.com for show notes, an archive of podcast episodes, and free compositions. Have a great week.